A 9-year-old boy pressed his ear against the cracked earth behind the house, and he heard, "Don't leave Grandpa down here anymore." Just a vague sentence. But it was the missing piece that would unlock a staggering truth. Carter Wren, age 9, had just moved here with his parents that very morning. The rented moving truck was still parked by the curb. His father, Stefan, lugging a heavy box on his shoulder, joked, "Next time Grandpa gives you something, make sure you check it out first before saying yes." His mother, Daisy, didn't reply. She was carefully wiping down an old picture frame, the only thing left of her long-missing father, who had once owned this very land. The wooden house stood quietly on the edge of Hardwill, a town that hadn't seen anyone live here for over 20 years. "Carter, don't go far from the house," Daisy called out, her tone clipped with frustration as she wrestled a jammed chair through the doorframe. "Yes, ma'am," Carter replied, but his eyes were locked on something deeper in the yard. He stepped outside. His old sneakers made soft, squishy sounds over the thick grass, prickly with tiny thorns. The late afternoon air still carried the dampness of the morning rain, the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something faintly acrid drifted in the breeze. Carter made his way toward a hidden corner where the grass grew unusually tall. There, amid the weeds, lay a patch of shattered tile. No one could tell what structure it once belonged to. Just a few red bricks still held some shape, though sunken and crumbling. What caught Carter's attention was the center of the tiled area. It seemed slightly raised. He knelt down and placed his hand on the protruding surface. It was cool, damp, and something about it felt off. Carter leaned in, pressing his ear against it like he often did as a child, listening for humming machines, running water, or simply to see if silence itself had a sound. And then he heard it, a voice, very faint, very weak. "Don't leave me down here." Carter froze. He looked up, took a step back, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar rhythm. He scanned the area, nothing but the wind, rustling leaves, and sunlight slanting through the old trees. "Grandpa," he whispered, his throat dry. Then, as if by instinct, Carter bent down again, bringing his ear closer to the ground. Silence. He shut his eyes and focused. "Don't leave me down here." The voice seemed to come from somewhere deep below, carried through a narrow gap by the wind. It wasn't exactly a moan, but it was thick with exhaustion and despair. Carter scrambled backward, sprang to his feet, and staggered away from the cracked stone patio. He didn't scream, not yet, but his steps grew uneven. By the time he reached the back door, his whole body was trembling. Daisy turned around just as she was setting down a box of books. "Carter, what's wrong, honey?" He shook his head, then nodded. "There's someone down there." Carter's voice was unsteady, barely audible. "Down where?" "Under. The stone tiles behind the house. Someone spoke. They said, 'Don't leave me down there.'" Stefan stepped over, frowning. "Who? Who do you think is down there?" "I don't know." Carter shook his head, his eyes wide. It sounded like an old man, but really weak. So weak. The couple exchanged a glance. Stefan exhaled and sat beside his son. "You might have misheard something. Could have been a water pipe, or roots shifting underground. You know how old houses are, lots of strange noises." "It wasn't a sound, Dad," Carter whispered. "It was a sentence, a plea." The room went still. Daisy looked out into the backyard, her gaze suddenly distant. She had lived here once, when she was just a little girl. This land used to belong to Eugene, her father, who vanished more than 20 years ago. But what would Eugene have to do with that patch of broken stone? And why would Carter hear his voice? Daisy stood without another word. She walked slowly to the back door, eyes fixed on the moss-covered, cracked tiles, right where Carter had just come from, pale and shaken, with that haunting sentence. Carter clung to his mother's hand, still trembling. "I'm not making it up. I heard it, clearly." He doesn't want to be down there anymore." No one said a word. Only the golden light of dusk stretched across the backyard, casting shadows over the faded stones, where a secret, buried for over 2 decades, might now be stirring, whispering from beneath the earth. Rain began to fall around 6 p.m. Not heavy, just a cold, scattered drizzle, but enough to make the old wooden floor creak with dampness. Inside the house, a soft yellow light from the kitchen spilled onto the ceiling, casting a sense of false calm. Daisy was frying eggs for Carter. Stefan opened a can of stew, placed it on the electric stove and stirred. He glanced at his son. "Want me to add some cheese?" His voice was deliberately gentle, as if everything were still normal. Carter didn't respond. He sat upright, hands neatly folded on the worn wooden table, eyes fixed on the glass of water in front of him, like he was waiting for it to change color or reveal a secret. Stefan tried again. "Earlier, you said you heard someone. What did that voice sound like?" Carter blinked. After a long pause, he turned. "Like an old man," he said slowly, but not scary. He sounded sad. Daisy turned her head, fell silent for a few seconds. The boy went on. "He said, 'Don't leave him down there anymore,' and then he whispered, 'Eugene.'" The ladle in Stefan's hand froze mid-stir. Daisy gripped the handle of the skillet tighter, her eyes still fixed on the weak blue flame. "You heard that name clearly?" she asked, her voice raspy. Carter nodded. "Yes." He said, "My name is Eugene." Daisy froze. The spoon in her hand slipped and landed on the table with a faint, delicate sound, yet it rang sharp in the silence. "What did you just say?" She turned around, her voice faltering. Carter looked up, his dark brown eyes blinking in confusion, but he repeated himself, more certain this time. "He said his name." "I didn't catch it all, but he said, 'I'm Eugene. Don't leave me down here anymore.'" Stefan turned to his wife, his expression skeptical, but Daisy didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Carter, as if something had pulled her backward, into some place long buried. The air grew heavy. Stefan set down his container of noodles and stood, pulling his chair closer to hers. "You okay?" Daisy shook her head, barely. Then she walked out of the kitchen, straight toward the bedroom they hadn't finished unpacking. Carter watched her go, then whispered softly, "He said he misses you." Daisy heard him. She didn't turn around, but her hand paused at the doorframe. That night, after Carter had gone to bed, and Stefan was scrolling through the news on his phone, Daisy pulled out an old chest. It had been shoved under the dresser, wrapped in a faded cloth, thick with dust. The small lock was still intact. No key was needed. A gentle press of the finger was enough. Inside were things no one in the family had ever asked about. A yellowed photo frame, a few handwritten letters, a worn newspaper clipping, and a manila envelope. Holding a copy of her father's death certificate, Eugene Hartley. Daisy lifted each item with care, as though afraid she might disturb something that was still alive. She picked up the photo, taken in 1999, a tall man, middle-aged, with deep-set eyes, full hair and slightly rough hands, beaming as he stood in an apple orchard. Eugene Hartley, her father, the man who vanished without a trace in the winter of 2002. She had just turned 15. Back then, the local paper reported that Eugene Hartley had gone out for a morning walk in the woods and never returned. They called it a regrettable disappearance under treacherous terrain. A search followed, but it was small in scale and quickly abandoned. The man in charge was none other than the town's police chief, Wallace Grant, a man Daisy had never quite trusted, even as a child. 3 weeks later, an old leather hat belonging to Mr. Eugene was found lying near the edge of a creek, a few miles from the house. There was no body, no blood, no signs of a struggle or any clear accident, yet the police still closed the case with the conclusion: accidental death due to slipping, body lost in the current. The funeral was held simply, the coffin was completely empty, but still buried deep in the ground as if it were a required ritual. Very few relatives showed up. Among them was Martin Caldwell, Eugene's brother-in-law, who stood in as the family's representative to deliver the eulogy. His face bore not a single crease of grief, just a thin mask of courtesy, barely hiding a cold, brazen indifference. And from that day on, no one spoke of Eugene again, as if he had never existed. Daisy clutched the photo tightly, then unfolded a copy of the death certificate. At first glance, everything looked ordinary, but now her eyes scanned every line, every word, and something felt wrong. Date of death: January 12, certifying official, Wallace Grant. Witness signature: name unclear, simply marked MC. Location of death: Western Forest area, possible fall from height. She frowned. MC, Martin Caldwell. Martin was her father's brother-in-law, not a direct relative, and certainly not someone with the authority to confirm a death, and yet his name was on the record, signed as a witness. Daisy suddenly remembered the funeral. Martin reading the eulogy in a flat voice, his eyes never once meeting hers. Throughout the entire service, he avoided her gaze, as if hiding something, and now she was sure that death was far from simple. Daisy set the document down and reopened an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Eugene Hartley, local landowner, disappears in forest." But what caught her attention wasn't the article itself, it was the photo beside it. Eugene standing next to Wallace Grant and Martin Caldwell during the signing of a land deal 1 year prior. She exhaled slowly, eyes closing as hazy memories overlapped. Arguments about Eugene refusing to sell the northern parcel of land, Martin's frequent visits to the house, always glancing around as if inspecting something. The nights Eugene locked the basement and told Daisy's mother to keep everything in the house quiet. She remembered a moment, long forgotten until now, when her father once told her mother, "If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone, especially not Martin." She had been too young then to understand. But now, it was too late to ignore. Daisy rose to her feet. Rain still tapped softly at the window. She looked out at the backyard, the very place where Carter had heard the whisper, where the cracked stone tiles were hiding something buried deep beneath. And then she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "Eugene, if you really were my father, I won't leave you down there." In the dark, the bedside lamp cast a warm glow on the old photograph. Eugene Hartley, declared dead, smiled within the frame, as if he had never truly gone. The wall clock had just struck 1:17 a.m. The house was silent, as if everything inside it had fallen asleep. But in the downstairs bedroom, Daisy was still awake, staring up at the ceiling. She turned to look at Stefan. He was sleeping on his side, one hand resting on his chest, breathing steadily. But Daisy couldn't let it all fade like a passing dream. She sat up. Quietly, she slipped on a coat, then walked to the window. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving only a thin mist on the grass. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows on the broken brick patio, the very spot where Carter had heard the voice. The photo of her father, the death notice, the signature MC, they were all still echoing in her mind. Daisy turned back and gently shook her husband's shoulder. "Stefan?" He murmured, opening his eyes groggily. "Will you come outside with me?" "At this hour, what's going on?" He pushed himself upright, his voice still half asleep. "I need to look at that spot, the brick area, right now." Stefan looked at her for a moment. "This is about Eugene, isn't it? If I'm wrong, then by morning everyone will think we've lost our minds. But if I'm right, I think there's still hope that my father is alive." The words hung in the air. Stefan said nothing for a few seconds. Then he exhaled and reached for his coat. They each took a flashlight, a gardening spade, and a long iron bar. It was cold. The dew clung to their sleeves, making the thick fabric feel heavy. Daisy walked ahead, pointing to the brick patch Carter had shown them yesterday. "Here." They began removing the bricks. First the loose ones, then digging deeper. Stefan muttered, This thing must have been laid 100 years ago.
Who builds a patio like this?
Because it's not a patio, Daisy answered, her eyes fixed on her hands. Beneath the first layer of brick was a soft, damp-smelling soil. About 2 feet down, Stefan's shovel struck something solid. That sounds like metal. He dug a few more times, then pried it up. A curved sheet of metal emerged, rusted, pitted with corrosion. Stefan tapped it. The sound was deep and hollow. Not a septic lid, not a sealed container. Something bigger. Daisy knelt down, brushing away the mud around the edges, whispering as if afraid to wake someone. "This is a hatch." They slid the iron rod into the latch hole and pried together. The metal door let out a piercing screech, like the scream of rusted steel distorted after years of silence. A wave of rot, mold, and biting cold rose up. Under the flashlight's beam appeared a deep shaft, nearly 10 feet down, with damp stone steps covered in moss. The walls were built of hand-laid stone, an old-world construction style that could have dated back to Eugene's grandfather's time. Daisy looked at Stefan. "Will you come down with me?" He hesitated. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "If Carter didn't miss here, then my father might still be alive." Stefan took a deep breath and stepped forward, sweeping the flashlight across each stone step as he descended. Daisy followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder. Their shoes struck the stone, echoing in low, heavy thuds, like a heartbeat trapped in a chest. As they neared the bottom, the beam revealed a small rectangular chamber. Mossy stone walls, a slanted wooden cot, a few scattered belongings, a broken chair. No natural light, no way out. And then, from the darkest corner, a sound broke the silence. A faint moan, like breath struggling to exist. Stefan flinched, swung the light toward the sound. A figure sat slumped against the wall, frail, beard and hair down to his chest, eyes cloudy and rimmed in red. The man lifted a trembling hand. His mouth moved, voice hoarse, quivering, but unmistakable. "Daisy." She froze, stepped back. Stefan's arm wrapped around her, not to restrain but to catch her in case she collapsed. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's him," Stefan said, his voice no longer steady. "My father is alive." That man, Eugene Hartley, sat before them, his sunken eyes still recognizing Daisy even after 20 years, even now that she was a grown woman of 35. Daisy stepped forward, tears spilling down her face. "Dad, it's me." Eugene moved his lips again, no words now, only breath, faint, shattered. But in those dim, cloudy eyes, a fragile spark still burned. A spark that had waited far too long to see family again. The cold chamber was no longer silent, no longer the cursed treasure vault the town whispered about. It was now evidence, a living witness of a crime long buried. And everything was only just beginning. The wind from the forest howled through the cracks in the window. The house remained dark, lit only by the shaky beam of a phone flashlight sweeping down the hallway. Stefan was carrying Eugene on his back. The old man's body was frail, brittle, as light as a soaking wet coat, yet it gave off a pungent mix of rusted metal and years-old mildew. Carter stood frozen at the kitchen doorway, his bare feet smeared with mud. He hadn't been able to sleep and had quietly opened the window to peek into the backyard, only to witness something far beyond anything he could have imagined. His mother in tears, his father hauling an old man with a silver beard up from the ground. Neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the wet squelch of dripping mud. "Who is he?" Carter whispered. Daisy didn't answer. She bent down, gently brushing Eugene's matted hair with a trembling hand. "He's your grandfather." They laid Eugene down on the old sofa next to the fireplace. Stefan covered him with a blanket, turned on the small gas heater, then pulled out his phone to call the village's on-call doctor, Mrs. Maribel. Even though it was well past midnight, she picked up right away. "What's going on, Stefan? Someone hurt?" "We found someone. Under the old foundation. It's Eugene Hartley." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Stay there. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Daisy sat beside Eugene, gripping his hand tightly. It was thin, cold, and shaking in waves. His pulse was weak. But still there.
Eugene muttered faintly.
"Daisy, you're still little. Don't go running into the woods again. It's almost dark. Dad, it's me. I'm grown now. You're home, you're safe." Eugene opened his eyes, looked at her, but it was like his gaze passed right through her. "Where's Doris?" Daisy's voice caught. "Mum's gone, 5 years ago." He closed his eyes again. A tear slipped down the deep wrinkle beside his eye. "So it's true, I'm not dreaming." After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice ragged, broken. "Wallace lied to me. Martin too. Don't trust them." Aunt Maribel arrived with her medical bag, stepping in like a gust of cold wind. She didn't ask many questions, just quietly turned on her flashlight and placed her wrinkled hand on Eugene's neck, checking his pulse and breathing.
The soft yellow beam lit up his gaunt face, silver stubble covering his jaw, dust clinging to his skin, and scattered sores across his cheeks. "He's alive," Maribel said gently, "but very weak. I need to check his reflexes." Eugene didn't open his eyes right away. He only groaned faintly, lips trembling. Daisy knelt beside the bed, holding her father's hand, her voice shaking with emotion. "Dad? Can you hear me? It's me, Daisy." After a moment, Eugene's eyes cracked open. His pupils tightened under the light, but he saw. He trembled slightly, trying to lift his frail hand, and whispered, "Daisy." Daisy broke into tears. Stefan quickly propped him up so Maribel could check his blood pressure. The doctor frowned and shook her head. Severe malnutrition, prolonged dehydration, signs of respiratory inflammation, possibly joint damage from lying in one position too long. "But what surprises me most," she lowered her voice, "he's more lucid than I expected." "He recognized me," Daisy said through her tears. "Not just that," Maribel looked at both of them. "He remembered the name Wallace." Stefan narrowed his eyes. "Wallace Grant?" Maribel nodded. "I just asked him who the mayor was, and he said, Wallace. Wallace Grant, the traitor." Stefan turned to Daisy, then said quietly, "I heard him whisper earlier. They staged the accident. They wanted the land. They needed you to disappear. What does that mean?" Daisy tightened her grip on her father's hand, leaning close to his face. "Dad, what did they do to you?" Eugene drew a strained breath, his voice rough and broken. "They drugged the tea, made me confused. I remember falling into a deep sleep, and when I woke up, I was already in the cellar." "What did you live on all those years?" Daisy asked, eyes wide in horror. Eugene swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "At first, they left some canned food, crackers, water. Every couple months someone would open a small hatch and drop more in, but that started fading away. I learned to catch water from the vent pipe and used fire to boil rainwater." He paused, then said with a shiver, "I ate insects, roots growing between the stones. There were times I thought I was already dead." Carter stood near the door, barely daring to breathe. He looked at his mother, her eyes red, her hands still clutching the blanket wrapped around her elderly father. Daisy whispered, "Are you sure it was Martin and Wallace who did this?" Eugene gave a faint nod. "They were the only two with a key. I refused to sell the land. Martin lost his temper. Wallace needed money for his campaign. I wouldn't sign the papers, and a few days later, I was poisoned." "You knew they locked you down there?" Stefan asked, stunned. "I did," Eugene said, his voice tight. "I heard them. Right at the entrance to the cellar, Wallace said, 'Just leave him there. No one will suspect. Once the funeral's done, it'll all blow over.'" The room fell into a suffocating silence. Only the sound of rain tapping against the porch roof remained. Eugene turned his head toward Daisy. "They thought I was dead, but this land, I won't let them take it." Daisy gripped her father's frail hand, nodding slowly. "I promise, this time, no one's putting you down there again." Silence. The room seemed frozen in time. Carter looked at his mother, and for the first time in his life saw her trembling, not from the cold, but from a quiet, rising fury. They declared my father dead on paper, left him alive in a hole. Daisy murmured, then turned to Stefan. I won't let this go, even if I have to expose this whole town. Aunt Maribel spoke gently. We need to keep this quiet for now. If word gets out too soon, they might try to finish the job. And this time for real. Daisy turned to Carter. He was still standing there, wide-eyed, his little hands gripping the cuffs of his pajama sleeves. You were the first to hear him, she said. Carter nodded. He called to me. I heard it clearly. Maribel leaned toward him, tilting her head. Can you repeat what he said, sweetheart? Carter hesitated, then closed his eyes. Don't leave me down here anymore. The words echoed, not as the ramblings of a child, but as the key that would unlock a buried truth. Doctors, lawyers, justice, they would all have to get involved now. And Daisy knew she was no longer just Eugene Hartley's daughter. She was a living witness, the one who would drag an old nightmare back into the light, armed with the truth. Mornings near the forest usually began with the crowing of roosters, mixed with the wind whispering through the pines. But this morning, inside the small Wren family home, the usual sounds, the alarm clock ringing, the gas stove clicking on, the clink of a spoon against a teacup, were all drowned out by something else. A slow-burning restlessness simmering inside Daisy. She sat at the kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, the other flipping through an old notebook. Her eyes scanned her father's handwriting, slightly shaky but clear and purposeful. Eugene had spoken in fragments the night before, but in his gaze, Daisy had seen something that lingered. His final ounce of trust, reserved solely for her after 20 long years. Stefan entered the kitchen, holding a stack of papers and old property maps. I found these in the storage box in the garage. They're asset documents from back in 1999. Daisy picked them up. Her eyes stopped at one line. The Western Forest plot, where the house now stood, had originally belonged entirely to Eugene. But after 2001, a handwritten note appeared. Temporarily transferred to Martin Caldwell. Temporarily? Daisy frowned. My father never once mentioned transferring anything to Martin. Stefan laid down a yellowed newspaper clipping. The Glenhaven Chronicle, March 2002. Eugene Hartley, missing after mysterious forest incident. Sheriff Grant declares accident. Wallace Grant, Daisy exhaled. Martin's best friend since high school. He even officiated Martin's wedding to my Aunt Myra, Mom's older sister. 2 hours later, they arrived at the town library. The archive room was tucked away in the basement, packed with thousands of old files, paper maps, investigative reports, and yearly newspaper records. Daisy pulled on a pair of gloves and murmured, If anyone tampered with the files, they must have left a trace. She flipped through the original reports from the disappearance. In the first incident statement signed by Wallace Grant, one line stood out. No signs of foul play. A torn shirt fragment and traces of blood considered proof of death. Blood? Daisy frowned. They didn't even find a body and they called it a death just from a few bloodstains on a tree? Stefan, standing behind her, pointed at the signature. Look here, Wallace's signature doesn't match his usual penmanship. It looks like someone tried to forge it. Later that afternoon, as the last light of day filtered through the living room window, Stefan suddenly asked, Do you remember Ms. Mira, your old middle school literature teacher? Daisy looked up, momentarily frozen. That name dropped like a stone into the still waters of memories long left undisturbed. Mira Sutton, she repeated softly. She used to visit our house often. Back then, my father thought very highly of her. Every time she came over, the two of them would talk for hours in his study, about books, about land, about town affairs. She felt like part of the family. You told me about her, Stefan nodded. She was the only one at school who said Eugene Hartley was a decent man who'd been treated unfairly. But after the accident, she was demoted and eventually resigned. Daisy lowered her head.
A faint image surfaced in her mind: graduation day. Miss Mira standing at the far end of the schoolyard, not smiling, just staring toward the empty seat where her father should have been. She once told me, if one day you see something that feels wrong, don't stay silent like we adults did. Stefan sat down across from her, his eyes steady. She might know something? Maybe. She still has something important. Like a letter? Daisy murmured. Or a journal my father wrote but never got to send? Stefan nodded. If anyone ever heard Eugene talk about the land, about Martin, it would be Mira. Daisy clenched her fists. I need to see her. If anyone still holds a piece of the truth, it's Miss Mira Sutton. They made their way to Glenhaven Elementary. Miss Mira Sutton was now around 60, her hair streaked with grey, but her eyes still bright and sharp. Daisy Hartley. Or is it Daisy Wren now? My, you've grown. Mira smiled, then paused. This is about your father, isn't it? Daisy nodded. There was no need to explain. She pulled out a recent photo of Eugene. Mira stared at it for a long moment before gasping. Oh my God. Eugene is still alive? He said your name, he remembered the school, and said he sent you something. Daisy trailed off. Mira stared at her, then quietly turned and went into her study. She opened an old drawer and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with time. I never gave it to anyone. By the time it reached me, the news had already come that your father was gone. But Eugene had once told me, if anything ever happened, to give this to you. Daisy opened the letter, Eugene's handwriting trembling but clear. If I disappear, don't trust anyone but my daughter. Martin wants the land, Wallace wants to keep his seat. I won't back down. If there's an accident, check the paperwork. I didn't leave on my own. She placed the letter on the table. Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper tightly. Stefan whispered, "We have proof." Mira added, "And if you want justice, you'll need more than that. You'll need witnesses, people brave enough to speak the truth." On the drive back, the sun sank behind the pines. Daisy sat in silence, eyes gazing blankly out the window. "Dad spoke up," she said quietly. With every ounce of strength he had left, Stefan reached over and took her hand. "And you won't let them bury him again?" She nodded, eyes fixed forward. "That's right. They buried him once. But this time, I'll dig up everything, and the world will know." Early the next morning, the sky hung grey, like it was unsure whether to rain. Glenhaven hadn't changed much. The same old cars lined up outside the laundromat, the old man pouring coffee at Maple Diner, and the police cruiser parked in its usual spot in front of Town Hall, like time had somehow frozen over this place. But no one knew that inside a small house at the edge of the woods, a man believed to be dead was lying on a sofa, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his breath as thin as thread, and the truth he carried could destroy everything. Stefan was checking the water tank behind the kitchen when the doorbell rang. A man in his 40s, wearing a neon orange-yellow reflective vest and holding a clipboard, stepped in. "Good morning, I'm Rick, Geological Inspector for the Western Ridge. We received a report from town about potential ground subsidence in this area after the heavy rains." Stefan frowned. "We didn't file any report." The man offered a polite smile. "Probably came from the Land Services team with Martin Caldwell Construction. They were hired by the town to assess older zones." "I'm just the guy they sent out." That name, Martin Caldwell, sent a chill down Stefan's spine. Rick walked around the house, using a scanner and shining his flashlight into corners. When he reached the kitchen where Daisy was preparing medication for Eugene, he glanced briefly at the old man asleep on the couch. "Looks like this house has been renovated a few times. Did you used to have a basement here?" Daisy turned, her smile gone. "There's no basement, and this is private property. We don't consent to any inspection without official authorization." Rick paused, nodded. "Understood. We'll return with paperwork if needed." But just before stepping out the door, he added, "Sometimes, certain things are better left undisturbed, especially if they've been buried a long time." A few hours later, Stefan was helping Eugene into the bathroom. Carter stood by the doorway, his little face tense with worry. "Dad, Grandpa's moving so slow. I'm scared he might fall." Stefan nodded and kept a firm hold on his father-in-law's arm. But when they came back out, something was off. The hallway's wooden floor, slick from water, leaking out from under the sink, glistened under the light. Stefan reached for the wall for support, but Eugene, with his frail legs, slipped, hitting his head softly on the doorframe. "Grandpa!" Carter screamed. Fortunately, the injury wasn't serious. But when Stefan went back to check the water valve, he noticed something odd. A section of the rubber pipe had been loosened, twisted out of place. It wasn't natural wear. Someone had tampered with it. That afternoon, Daisy took Eugene for a follow-up appointment. Stefan stayed behind to inspect the rest of the plumbing around the house. Carter was allowed to walk down to the town's small grocery store, the one with the free ice cream machine for kids. He was just about to head home, a bag of cookies in hand, when he froze in the middle of the aisle. At the far end, behind the soda shelves, stood Martin Caldwell, tall, silver-haired, voice deep, and Wallace Grant, wearing a police uniform. Martin leaned in close, his voice low and sharp like a blade. "If that old man talks, everything we've covered up will come crashing down." Wallace glanced around, tugging his cap lower. "Keep it looking normal, but if he's thinking of opening his mouth..." He paused briefly, then added, "I know someone who can shut him up, for good." Carter pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding like a drum. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out an old recorder, one his mom used to use in class. He hit the red button. A faint beep sounded, but it was enough. He captured the last few seconds. Deal with him before he says a word. That night, Carter sat in his room with the lights off. The recorder lay still on his desk, its red light blinking softly. He didn't say a word, didn't show his mom, didn't call his dad. He just sat there, eyes wide, hands gripping the recorder like it was a ticking bomb. Outside his window, the wind swept across the backyard. The spot where Carter once heard that whisper. Now dead silent, but he knew that silence wasn't peace. It was darkness changing its shape. Down the street, a yellow truck sat motionless. Inside, Rick, the man in the reflective vest, held up a phone, eyes fixed on the house. "I've checked the ground," he said into the receiver. "They dug, and Eugene is still alive." On the other end, Martin's voice was ice cold. "Then finish it. I don't want him surfacing in public." Rick hesitated. "There's a kid. His daughter's boy. He's been snooping around, watching everything. He's not the type you can lure with candy." Silence. Then Martin replied slowly, "Then scare him. Kids who are scared know how to stay quiet." Rick stuffed the phone back into his pocket, eyes still locked on the window where Carter had just pulled the curtain shut. Rain tapped steadily against the truck's roof, and for the first time, what they feared wasn't Eugene. It was a 9-year-old boy who dared to listen. Carter pulled the small wooden chair closer to the bed, careful not to make a sound. He climbed up and sat neatly, both hands resting on his knees as if waiting for a signal only children could hear. On the bed, Eugene still had his eyes closed, his gaunt face and wrinkled skin bathed in the faint sunlight seeping through the thin curtains. "Grandpa," Carter whispered, "I brought the recorder today. If you want to keep telling the story from yesterday..." He paused, studying his grandfather's face. One side of Eugene's mouth twitched slightly. Then, very slowly, he opened his eyes. The scent of peppermint from the diffuser beside the bed lingered gently in the air. No one pushed, no one interrupted. It was just the two of them, a quiet child listening, and a man at the end of his life, finally given the chance to speak. Words no one had ever believed. Eugene Hartley, the man the whole town believed had died 2 decades ago, lay there, thin as a skeleton, his hair and beard white, his face hollow, but his eyes still holding a flicker of light. He wasn't asleep, he was revisiting his life, through the eyes of a grandson he'd never had the chance to hold. Carter nodded. A small arrow in 3 circles. It's between 2 broken bricks. The first day I went out to the yard, I thought someone had just scribbled on the ground. Eugene closed his eyes. His breathing seemed to slow. I drew it. With blood. I wasn't sure anyone would understand. But if someone paid attention, they'd know something was buried under there. Carter gently squeezed his hand. I understand now, Grandpa. After a while, Eugene began to speak. Back then, I didn't plan to go far. There were still things I hadn't finished. Then one evening, someone invited me over for dinner. Said it was just a talk. Nothing more. I was tired, but I went anyway. Eugene paused, eyes drifting up to the ceiling. That dinner, I remember the smell of food, the clinking of dishes. Then someone poured wine. After that, nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was in the basement. Total darkness, cold. I couldn't tell if it was day or night. No one called out. No one answered. Carter sat frozen. He'd never heard anything like this before. One day, someone stood above. He threw down a newspaper. Said I was dead. Told me if I ever tried to come out, people would think I was crazy or call me a fraud. Did you call for anyone? Carter asked. Of course I did. I screamed. I pounded on the walls. I hoped someone walking by would hear. But no one came. Only one housemaid ever asked questions, and the next day, she disappeared from town. So, how did you survive down there? Eugene closed his eyes, his voice rougher now. At first, they sent food through a tube, once a day. Never enough. But not enough to starve either. I guess they wanted me to stay alive, but no one to know I was. Then, were you waiting for someone to find you? Carter asked softly. Eugene looked at the boy. For the first time, his eyes lit up, faintly shining despite the haze of age. No, I wasn't waiting for anyone. I just thought, if someday someone truly listened, then at least I would have left behind a sign. I saw it, Carter whispered, and I heard you, even though I didn't know it was you at first. But you stopped, Eugene said slowly. You didn't walk away like the others. You looked closely. You didn't turn away. Silence settled between them. Carter lowered his head. He didn't know what to say. He simply held the man's hand. It was still cold, but no longer trembling. Eugene gently closed his eyes and smiled faintly. You're the first child who really listened. Carter bowed his head, his eyes burning. He wasn't good with big words. He just held on tighter. Outside the room, Daisy stood still, pressed against the wall, listening to every word. She didn't step in, but her shoulders shook. She understood. Her father had never truly abandoned her. She was the one who'd had to keep living with a lie. Evening light spilled down the old wooden hallway. In that little room, between 2 generations, a bridge had just been rebuilt. Not through blood, but through belief. Eugene rested with his eyes closed. Carter stayed by his side, unmoving. In his hand, his mother's old tape recorder gave a soft click. He had recorded everything Eugene said. This time, no one could ever claim he made it up. The sky was overcast. Grey clouds swept quickly over the faded red-tiled rooftops of Glenbrook. No one said it aloud, but the whole town seemed to be holding its breath, an unspoken sense that secrets buried too long were beginning to stir. Inside the Wren house, the small kitchen had turned into an unofficial command center. The table was covered with old papers, photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. Mira Sutton, Daisy's former teacher and now the high school principal, carefully unfolded a yellowed letter from a smudged, sealed envelope. A letter from Eugene to Attorney Rossman, dated March 2002, Mira murmured. He warned about interference from Martin and Wallace and asked the lawyer to delay any transfer of property if he were to suddenly disappear. Daisy leaned in to read. She immediately recognized the familiar handwriting, slanted to the right, a little shaky, from the father she had once believed was dead. The final line read, "If I go missing, don't let my daughter believe I abandoned her." She swallowed back tears. "We have to prove my father wasn't crazy. He didn't vanish on his own. He was the victim of an organized scheme to steal everything he had. Mira nodded, her voice firm. We need a witness. Someone who saw something and is still alive to tell the story. Benjamin Price, a freelance journalist known for investigating mysterious disappearances in small towns, had joined the group after reading Mira's short blog post titled The Man Who Survived the Stone Cellar. He had heard vague whispers about the Hartley family over the years, but had never found solid evidence. Until now. All right, Benjamin said, pulling out a chair and opening his laptop. I'll talk to Mrs. Edna. According to old records, she was the last housekeeper at the Hartley estate. And she disappeared without explanation just one day after Eugene went missing. She's still alive? Daisy asked. At Maplewood Nursing Home, on the outskirts of town. But according to the staff, she rarely speaks and often refuses to talk about the past. That afternoon, Benjamin made his way to Maplewood, carrying a worn folder and a black and white photo of the Hartley backyard. Mrs. Edna, silver-haired, frail but with eyes still sharp behind thick glasses, looked at him through the cracked open door. Wallace Grant? She repeated his first question, her voice dry. I don't know that man. Benjamin didn't show any disappointment. Instead, he gently took out a photograph and placed it on the small table beside the teapot. I just need to know what you saw. That night, the night Eugene disappeared. You were in this house. This photo was taken just a few weeks earlier. You were still listed in the family's housekeeping log. Edna looked at the photo, and for the first time since the conversation began, her eyes changed. Slowly, but noticeably. No more avoidance. No more emptiness. Just the truth, Benjamin said quietly. You don't have to be afraid of them anymore. Edna let out a long breath, as if the secret she'd been carrying had finally grown too heavy. That night, I heard something strange in the backyard. At first I thought it was a raccoon, but when I looked out the window, I saw a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat walking away from the back of the house. It was Wallace. No mistake. I worked with that man for 10 years. Did you tell anyone? Benjamin asked, his voice soft. Martin called me into the parlor the next day. He said, if you mention Wallace again, you won't find work within 100 miles of this place. And he meant it. I was fired that very day. Benjamin nodded slightly. Thank you, Edna. Your words alone might not hold up in court. But if I find supporting evidence, would you be willing to sign a formal statement? Edna looked at him for a long, long time, then slowly nodded. If it helps that girl Daisy, I will. Later that night, Daisy sat beside the old wooden chest her mother had once kept. Her mother, Hilda, had died from a fall down the stairs when Daisy was 14. That fall had always left a strange, unspoken scar inside her. In a hidden compartment at the bottom of the chest, she found a small notebook, the pages yellowed but the handwriting still clear. Martin keeps dodging Eugene every time land comes up. Something feels wrong, I'm scared. The final entry was dated the day before Hilda's death. I have to tell Eugene, but Martin came to the house last night, talked to me in the basement for a long time. Today the stairs are broken. Daisy felt the blood drain from her spine, one vertebra at a time. Elsewhere in the house, Carter and Stefan were working together to open the rusted lock under the basement stairs, the place where Eugene had once been kept. I saw it the other day, covered in dust, but I didn't dare touch it, Carter whispered. Stefan pried gently with a pair of pliers. The lock popped open after a few tries. Inside the stone cavity was an old tin box, filled with faded papers, still sealed. Eugene Hartley's handwritten will, Daisy read aloud. I, Eugene Hartley, leave full ownership of the Glenbrook property to my daughter, Daisy Hartley. No one else may interfere without my presence. Mira turned to Benjamin. Need any clearer proof? Benjamin nodded. Just one more step left, bringing all of this into the light. In that moment, they were no longer just individuals. They were a team, a group of people who dared to speak up. who dared to stand against those who once believed they could silence an entire town. And this time, their voices would carry farther than any lie ever could. That morning, the town square in Glenbrook was more crowded than ever. People pressed in around the old town hall, which had been temporarily converted into the venue for a closed-door hearing. There were no major news outlets, no state spokespeople, only neighbors, familiar shopkeepers, and even those who once believed Eugene Hartley was long dead. At the top of the steps, a long table draped in a grey cloth. Seated at the center were 3 town commissioners, their faces tight with tension. Martin Caldwell entered from a side door, neatly dressed in a tailored suit, shaking hands with a few old acquaintances. Sheriff Wallace Grant followed closely behind, avoiding eye contact, one hand gripping the pistol at his hip, a reflex more than anything else. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The back doors opened. Stefan appeared, gently guiding Eugene into the room. The air felt suspended. The man, presumed dead for over 2 decades, now stood before them, flesh and bone. His hands trembled, but his gaze remained steady. "Mr. Eugene Hartley wishes to speak," Mira announced, her voice clear and unwavering. "He is currently under temporary family guardianship with special authorization from his physician." Eugene gave a faint nod. His voice was hoarse but firm. "I was never dead. I was betrayed, imprisoned beneath my own house. And now, people need to hear the truth." No one moved. No one questioned it. Benjamin rose from the audience, holding Carter's old voice recorder. "I have a recording, capturing an exchange between 2 individuals, Martin Caldwell and Wallace Grant. I ask everyone to listen." He pressed play. Carter's young voice came through. "They said, 'We have to deal with it before he says anything.' I heard it clearly." Then a deep, gravelly man's voice followed. "If he opens his mouth, we're all finished. You know what to do, Wallace." A wave of gasps and murmurs swept the room. Martin jumped to his feet. "Fabricated. You'd believe a child. That old tape recorder isn't admissible evidence." But Mira had already stepped forward, holding a worn letter, its handwriting verified. "This is a handwritten letter from Mr. Eugene Hartley, dated April 2002, addressed to Attorney Rossman, never sent. In it, he wrote clearly, 'If I disappear, Wallace Grant and Martin Caldwell are to be held responsible.'" Wallace's face turned ashen. Martin gripped the armrest of his chair tightly. Daisy stood up, her voice firm. "And this is the will, written by Eugene himself, fingerprint verified. It names one sole heir, me." Ethan Lynn, the Hartley family's new legal representative, stepped forward and handed a file to the town council. "This is documentation showing that Martin Caldwell transferred nearly $340,000 from the town's land development fund into his personal account over the past 3 years, starting the year Mr. Eugene went missing." The room erupted. Several people stood up. Someone shouted, "He stole from us." Wallace got to his feet. I was just following protocol. No one asked me to reopen the missing person case." "I didn't know he was alive," then came a voice, small but clear and unwavering, that cut through every excuse in the room. "He told me. I heard him clearly." Everyone turned. Carter, in a pale blue shirt, stepped forward from the front row. He looked directly at the council, then turned to the crowd. "No one believed me, but I heard him speak. 'Don't leave me down there anymore.' And I told my mom. I wasn't lying." Eugene smiled through his tears. He raised his hand toward his grandson, his fingers trembling but full of pride. A long silence fell over the room. The town commissioner finally rose. "We will establish a special committee to escalate this case to the county level. There is substantial ground for a criminal investigation. And Mr. Eugene Hartley, welcome home." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then sweeping through the hall. The breathless tension that had held the room hostage for nearly an hour gave way to raw emotion, not only for justice finally done for Eugene, but for a child brave enough to speak and finally be heard. Early in the morning, the old house at the edge of the forest basked in soft golden sunlight. The once overgrown lawn had been neatly trimmed, the moss-covered wall was freshly painted, and a wooden sign hung on the front gate, carved with a simple inscription. Home of Eugene Hartley, 1942 to... Eugene sat in a hand-woven chair by the porch, a wool blanket draped over his knees, a cup of hot tea in his hand. Carter sat at his feet, his small fingers clumsily placed on the keys of an old wooden piano. The first notes rang out, off-key but full of determination. "You're playing an F instead of a G," Eugene said, his voice much stronger than before. "Try again. This time, don't look at your hands." Carter pressed his lips together and nodded. Daisy stepped outside holding a newly framed photograph. Inside it was a black and white picture, a young Eugene holding baby Daisy in his arms, a small guitar beside them. She placed the frame on the windowsill. "I want my son to learn from the one who taught me," she said softly, eyes misty. From a distance, the rumble of truck wheels rolled across the dirt road. Benjamin Price, the journalist who once didn't believe Carter, had since become a regular visitor to the little house. He brought with him a bundle of printed newspapers. On the front page, a bold headline read, "The boy said, 'Don't leave him down there,' and a whole town listened." "The story has spread across the entire state," Benjamin said as he handed the paper to Eugene. "I've never seen anything go viral like this. That one sentence, it stirred something deep in people." Eugene turned the page, his hands trembling, his eyes welling up. "I thought I'd die underground, and no one would even remember my name." Benjamin shook his head gently. "You didn't die. You were buried. But people heard you, because Carter gave you a voice." A few days later, a small ceremony was held on the very land once taken by Martin. A memorial plaque was placed there, made of smooth black stone engraved in silver letters, "For the voices that were once buried. Justice begins with truth, and truth begins when someone chooses to listen." Daisy stood beside Mira, now more than just a school principal but a true companion. Mira had organized a special assembly for the middle school students, focused on justice, courage, and the power of a child's voice. "We used to teach children to stay silent in front of adults," Mira said to the crowd. "But today, a 9-year-old boy reminded us that truth has no age." Carter, holding a microphone, looked around. There were classmates, adults, journalists, even some of the very people who once doubted him. "My grandpa was underground for 20 years, Carter said slowly, "but he wasn't silent. He called out to me, and I heard him. I'm not special. I just believed him." For a moment, no one spoke. Then came the applause, not loud or showy, but steady, sincere. That evening, the wind had gone still. Eugene sat alone in the small garden behind the house. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft shadows on his weathered face, now calm. "For the first time in 20 years, he whispered, "I didn't dream about the stone walls." From the window, Carter looked out and smiled gently. There was no one left underground, no truth left buried, no forgotten old man. Only a human being returned to his rightful place in the world. Maybe what touches our hearts most isn't just the truth being uncovered, but that a 9-year-old boy chose to listen when the rest of the world walked away. Carter and Eugene's story isn't just about justice. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices carry the farthest if we're willing to pause, to believe, and to speak up. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever been the only one who believed in something no one else did? What did you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear from you. And hey, how have you been lately? If today's been a hard day, I hope this story brought you even a little warmth. Don't forget to drink something warm, rest a little, or simply take a slow, deep breath, because you deserve care. Thank you for being here, not just as a viewer, but as part of this community of kindness and empathy.